Hello there, and welcome back to Coldman Survival, where the coldest corners of the world get a little warmer just by talking about them slowly. Tonight we are going somewhere that most of the planet forgets exists for half the year, a place where the sun sets once and then does not rise again for months, a place where a few dozen people choose, on purpose, to live through a darkness longer than any winter you have ever known. Tonight's question sounds simple, and it is not. How do scientists sleep through Antarctica's endless winter? Before we go any further, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher than usual. Antarctica has a way of making every other cold feel like a mild inconvenience, and it is worth feeling that contrast now while you are warm before we go looking for the people who are not. Somewhere on the ice tonight, in a station bolted to a shelf of frozen water thousands of kilometers from the nearest tree, a handful of people are getting ready for bed in exactly the same unremarkable way you might. Brushing teeth, checking a clock, deciding whether to read one more page. The strangeness is not in what they do before sleep. The strangeness is in what surrounds them while they do it. Antarctica in winter is not simply cold the way a winter evening at home is cold. It is a different category of cold, one that most human bodies have never been asked to survive unassisted. Temperatures at inland stations regularly fall below -60 degrees Celsius, occasionally lower. Cold enough that exposed skin can suffer frostbite in minutes. Cold enough that ordinary machinery groans and sometimes refuses to start. And layered on top of that cold is the darkness. Not evening darkness, not the kind that eases in and gives way to morning. Polar night, the kind that settles over the continent for months at a time and does not lift until the sun finally returns, low and pale, weeks later than anyone would like. If you find this kind of unhurried, quietly strange science comfortable at the end of a long day, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this small, patient corner of the internet find its way to other people who would rather fall asleep to something calm and true than something loud and manufactured for panic. There are no dramatic captions here. No thumbnail with wide eyes and an exclamation mark. Just the ice, the dark, and the people who have learned to rest inside both. So tonight, settle in, and let's walk through it together. Not with urgency, but with the same patience the ice itself seems to have. We'll start with the place itself, because you cannot understand how someone sleeps through Antarctica's winter without first understanding what that winter actually is. Antarctica does not experience seasons the way most of the inhabited world does. It experiences extremes and very little in between. During the austral summer, from roughly November through February, the sun barely sets at some stations at all, circling low around the sky in a loop that never quite dips below the horizon. It is a strange kind of daylight, thin and silvery, but daylight nonetheless. And during those months, the continent briefly fills with visiting scientists, support staff, pilots, and researchers running experiments that can only happen when supply flights are possible and temperatures are, relatively speaking, forgiving. Then, sometime in February or March, the last flights leave. The runways close. The ships that resupplied the coastal stations turn back toward warmer water, and the ice begins closing in behind them the way a door closes behind someone who has just said goodbye. What is left behind is called the winter over crew, and at most stations that crew is small. At the South Pole itself, the population can shrink from over 100 people in summer to somewhere around 40 or 50 for the winter months. At smaller stations scattered around the coast and interior, the number can be lower still, sometimes only a dozen or so, sharing a handful of buildings with no possibility of leaving, and no possibility of anyone new arriving until spring. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not something most people ever choose in their lives. Once winter closes in, there is no ambulance flight for anything but the most extreme emergency. And even then, only if weather allows it, which for long stretches it will not. There is no quick trip into town. There is no town. The nearest hospital, the nearest grocery store, the nearest other human being outside the station might be over 1,000 kilometers away, buried under snow, in a place no aircraft can safely reach until the sun and the temperatures cooperate again. Whoever agrees to stay through an Antarctic winter is agreeing, in a very literal sense, to be cut off from the rest of the species for the better part of a year. And then there is the darkness itself, which behaves differently depending on where you are on the continent. At the geographic South Pole, the sun sets once in late March and does not rise again until late September, 6 months of unbroken night. Along the coast, the darkness is not always total, sometimes fading into a long twilight rather than complete black, but it is still nothing like an ordinary winter anywhere else on Earth. Human beings did not evolve for this. Our bodies expect a sun that rises and sets every day, a rhythm as old as the species itself, and Antarctica simply removes that rhythm for months at a time, leaving each station to build an artificial one in its place. That, more than the cold, is often what winter overcrews describe as the hardest part. Cold can be managed with walls, insulation, and heaters, engineering problems solved by people who are extremely good at solving engineering problems. But a body's internal clock is not so easily reasoned with. It listens to light, mostly, and when the light disappears for half a year, the clock does not know what to do with itself. Sleep researchers who have studied polar stations describe crews drifting later and later some winters, entire small communities slowly sliding their waking hours forward and backward as the body searches for a rhythm the sky is no longer providing. It would be easy to imagine this as a horror story, a group of unlucky people trapped somewhere hostile and left to cope. But that is not quite what winter over life is, and it is worth correcting that picture early, because the truth is stranger, and in some ways, more reassuring. Most of the people who spend an Antarctic winter on the ice chose it. Many apply for the position specifically, some more than once, drawn by research, by the unusual kind of quiet, or simply by curiosity about what it is like to live somewhere this far removed from everything familiar. Stations are not survival shelters improvised at the last minute. They are by now carefully engineered small towns, purpose-built over decades to keep a few dozen people not just alive, but reasonably comfortable through a winter longer and darker than nearly anywhere else humans have ever chosen to live. That comfort, and how it is built, room by room and habit by habit, is where we're headed next. Because before we can understand how anyone actually falls asleep out there, we need to understand what kind of building makes that sleep possible in the first place, and what it took to design a place where warmth survives even when nothing survives outside its walls. Let's talk about the buildings themselves, because they are, in a very real sense, the first and most important layer of protection between a sleeping scientist and a temperature that could kill an unprotected person in well under an hour. The station most people picture when they imagine Antarctic research, the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, is a good place to start, because its design says a great deal about what decades of experience taught engineers about surviving there. The current station sits raised on stilts above the ice, an elevated structure rather than something built directly on the snow. This is not an aesthetic choice. It exists because snow accumulates and drifts constantly in Antarctica, and a building sitting flat on the surface will slowly be buried, its entrances swallowed, its walls pressed by growing weight over years. Raising the structure lets wind pass beneath it, which helps keep drifting snow from piling against the building the way it would against anything sitting low and exposed. Inside, the station functions less like a research outpost and more like a small, self-contained town under a single roof. There are dormitory-style sleeping quarters, individual rooms rather than open bunks, a detail that matters more than it might first appear. There is a galley, essentially a full kitchen and dining hall, because feeding several dozen people balanced meals through 8 isolated months requires the same planning as feeding a small restaurant, except the restaurant cannot restock. There are labs, workshops, a gym, a greenhouse in some stations for growing small amounts of fresh produce, medical facilities staffed by doctors trained for isolation medicine, and long hallways connecting it all so that no one ever has to step outside into the cold, simply to move from their bedroom to the dining hall. That last detail is easy to overlook, but it shapes daily life enormously. In many polar stations, the goal of the architecture is to make it possible to live entirely indoors for days at a time if the weather demands it, and during the depths of winter, it often does. Blizzards at these latitudes are not gentle snowfalls. They can reduce visibility to almost nothing, turning even a short walk between buildings into something genuinely dangerous. Some stations run rope lines between structures, specifically so that anyone who must go outside during a whiteout has something to hold on to, something to keep them oriented when the world outside has become an undifferentiated wall of white and wind. Heating, unsurprisingly, is the backbone of everything. Stations rely on diesel generators and carefully managed fuel reserves, calculated months in advance, because there is no possibility of an emergency fuel delivery once the last flight has gone. Heat is distributed through the building's interior, so that regardless of what the thermometer reads outside, the temperature inside common areas and sleeping quarters remains close to what anyone would consider ordinary room temperature, somewhere in the high teens to low 20s Celsius. Insulation is heavy and multi-layered, walls built thick enough that the difference between inside and outside can exceed 80 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights, an extraordinary gap for any structure to maintain reliably year after year in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Sleeping quarters themselves tend to be small, practical, and private. This is a deliberate shift from older station designs, which sometimes used shared or dormitory-style rooms. Experience taught station planners that after weeks of working, eating, and socializing with the same small group of people day after day, having a door that closes on a space that belongs to no one else becomes one of the most valuable comforts a person can have. A private room, however modest, gives winter-over crew members somewhere to simply be alone, an increasingly precious thing in a community where privacy outside is not an option and privacy inside becomes one of the few controllable comforts left. Within those rooms, the details are ordinary in a way that feels almost startling against the backdrop of everything outside. A bed, usually a single, with warm bedding suited to a climate-controlled interior, rather than the outside temperature. A desk, perhaps a small shelf for books or personal items brought from home, since luggage space on the last flight in is limited and chosen carefully. Blackout curtains or coverings over the windows, essential not because of sunlight streaming in, since for much of winter there is none, but because station lighting and the occasional glow of the aurora can otherwise interrupt the deep, uninterrupted dark that makes sleep easier to hold on to. It is worth pausing here to notice what all of this engineering is really doing. It is not simply keeping people from freezing, though that is the baseline requirement beneath everything else. It is recreating, as closely as possible, the ordinary comforts of home, inside a place that offers none of them naturally. A private room, a comfortable bed, a stable, livable temperature, food arriving reliably at expected times. These are not luxuries out there. They are the deliberate result of decades of trial, error, and redesign aimed at making sure that the human body, which never evolved for polar night or 80-degree temperature gradients, can still find something approaching rest. And still, even with all of that engineering solved, there remains the harder problem, the one no amount of insulation can fix on its own. What do you do about a body that has no sunrise to wake it, and no sunset to tell it the day is done? That question, and the elaborate daily structure crews build to answer it, is where we're headed next. Here is a strange fact worth sitting with. Some of the best engineered buildings on Earth, filled with heating systems, insulation, and generators capable of holding back a temperature difference of 80 degrees, are still not enough on their own to guarantee a good night's sleep. Because the thing most responsible for regulating human sleep is not temperature at all. It is light. And in Antarctica, for months at a time, light simply is not available in any natural form. The human circadian rhythm, the internal clock that tells a body roughly when to feel alert and when to feel tired, depends heavily on cues from sunlight. Specialized cells in the eye respond to daylight and help synchronize the release of hormones like melatonin, which rises in the evening as light fades and falls again as morning approaches. This system evolved over an almost unimaginable stretch of time, shaped by a planet that reliably offered a sunrise and a sunset every single day. It was never designed to handle 6 straight months of darkness, or for that matter, 6 straight months of near-constant summer light. Antarctica offers both, on opposite ends of the year, and neither one is easy on a body built for the ordinary rhythm most of the world still enjoys. During the deep winter months, with no sunrise to anchor the day, many winter-over crew members describe a strange sensation of time becoming unmoored. Without the sky offering any cues, it becomes entirely possible to lose track of whether it is morning or evening simply by glancing outside, because outside looks identical at every hour. Sleep researchers who have studied polar stations have documented what is sometimes called free-running sleep, where, left unmanaged, an isolated group's collective sleep schedule can begin drifting later and later, day by day, chasing a rhythm the environment is no longer providing any anchor for. Left unaddressed, this drift can cause real problems. Poor sleep affects mood, concentration, decision-making, and the ability to safely operate equipment or work outside in already dangerous conditions. Station doctors and psychologists, aware of this risk from decades of prior winters, do not simply hope it works itself out. They build structure deliberately, and they build it early, often before the darkness has even fully set in, because establishing a rhythm is far easier than trying to recover one that has already come apart. The most important tool in that structure is simply a fixed schedule, enforced with more discipline than most people maintain in their ordinary lives back home. Meals are served at the same times each day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner arriving on a predictable clock, regardless of what the sky is or is not doing outside. Work shifts follow set hours. Common spaces are lit brightly during what the station has designated as daytime and dimmed in the evening, mimicking, as closely as artificial lighting can manage, the transition a sunset would ordinarily provide. Some stations use light therapy specifically, bright light boxes designed to deliver the kind of intense, full-spectrum light exposure that would normally come from morning sun, timed carefully to help reset and hold each person's internal clock in place. Exercise plays a role here as well, and most stations take it seriously enough to include a proper gym among their limited indoor space. Regular physical activity has been shown to help regulate mood and sleep quality, and for a population that cannot simply step outside for a walk whenever they choose, an indoor gym becomes one of the few remaining ways to keep the body doing what bodies are supposed to do, moving, working, tiring in a healthy way that makes rest easier to find at the end of the day. Sleep hygiene, in the more literal sense, gets unusual attention too. Blackout coverings over windows matter more here than almost anywhere else on Earth, because the alternative, during certain phases of the aurora or under a bright moon, reflecting off endless snow, can be surprisingly disruptive to a room that is supposed to be signaling rest. Station staff are often encouraged to avoid bright screens late in their personal evening hours, the same advice given to nearly everyone else in the world, but carrying extra weight here, where every other natural cue for evening has already been stripped away by the sky itself. What emerges from all of this is something close to an artificial day, built by hand, hour by hour, meal by meal, out of habit rather than sunlight. It sounds almost fragile when described this way. A schedule instead of a sun, routine instead of rhythm. But it works, reliably enough that station crews complete these winters year after year, largely because human beings turn out to be remarkably good at accepting a substitute clock, provided the substitute is consistent and provided everyone around them is keeping the same time. That consistency does not come from architecture or lighting alone, though. It comes from the small community itself, the handful of people sharing this manufactured day together, eating the same meals at the same hours, watching the same darkness outside the same windows. What that shared life actually looks like, night after night, through 6 months without a sunrise, is where we're headed next. Life inside an Antarctic station during winter is, in many ways, smaller than life almost anywhere else a person might choose to live. Not smaller in comfort necessarily, but smaller in scope. The world shrinks down to a handful of hallways, a dining room, a gym, a lounge, a lab, and the same faces appearing in each of them, day after day, for months, without a single new arrival to change the pattern. It is worth imagining what that actually feels like, because most of us, even during difficult stretches of isolation, know that eventually the circle of people around us will change. Someone will move away. Someone new will start at work. A friend will visit. In an Antarctic winter, none of that happens. The people present when the last flight leaves in March are, with rare and serious exceptions, the same people present when the sun finally returns in September. This creates a particular kind of closeness that station veterans often describe with a mixture of fondness and honesty. Small groups isolated together for long stretches tend to develop their own quiet culture, their own inside jokes, their own unspoken rules about who prefers silence in the evening and who prefers company. Psychologists studying isolated environments, including polar stations, space analog missions, and submarine crews, have found strikingly similar patterns across all of them. Early weeks tend to bring a kind of cautious politeness, as people who barely know each other settle into shared space. A middle stretch, often the hardest, brings friction, small irritations magnified by repetition and by the absence of anywhere else to go to cool down. And a later stage, if the group holds together well, often settles into something closer to genuine family, a group of people who have simply run out of reasons to perform for one another and have settled into being exactly who they are. Station life is structured, deliberately, to support this settling. Common areas are not an afterthought. Lounges are furnished with couches, board games, books, sometimes musical instruments brought by crew members who could not imagine 6 months without one. Many stations maintain small libraries built up over years of past winter-over crews, leaving behind whatever they finished reading, so that each new group inherits a strange, accidental collection shaped by the tastes of scientists and technicians who came before them. Movie nights are common, sometimes formalized into a weekly tradition, sometimes simply happening whenever enough people feel like gathering in front of a screen instead of retreating to their rooms. Work, too, provides its own rhythm and its own sense of purpose that helps carry people through the darker stretches of the season. Winter-over crews are rarely idle. Scientists continue running experiments that specifically require the extreme conditions winter provides, including certain astronomical observations that benefit from the exceptionally dry, dark, stable air found at inland stations during these months. Support staff, meanwhile, keep the station itself running, maintaining generators, monitoring systems, managing supplies, and handling the countless small mechanical problems that arise when equipment is asked to function reliably at temperatures it was never designed to enjoy. Everyone, in some sense, is working toward the same unspoken goal, which is simply making sure the group and the station both make it to spring intact. Meals anchor the day more than almost anything else, and stations tend to take food seriously in a way that might surprise people who imagine winter-over life as a grim, rationed existence. Chefs are often specifically hired for these postings, tasked with the considerable challenge of feeding several dozen people, 3 meals a day, for months, using only what was flown or shipped in before the season closed. Fresh produce becomes scarce and eventually disappears entirely at the more remote stations, replaced by frozen, canned, and dried alternatives, though some stations maintain small hydroponic or greenhouse setups specifically to provide a few fresh vegetables and herbs through the darkest months. A small but meaningful psychological comfort as much as a nutritional one. Special meals mark the passage of time in ways that matter more than they might elsewhere. Midwinter, the point at which the sun reaches its lowest and the darkness is at its deepest, is celebrated at most Antarctic stations with an elaborate dinner, sometimes the most carefully prepared meal of the entire season. It is, in a sense, an artificial holiday, invented by necessity, marking not a date on a calendar shared with the rest of the world, but a turning point specific to this small, isolated community. After midwinter, the days will, at least in principle, begin working their way back toward light, even if the actual sunrise remains months away. That shift, more psychological than physical, is treated with real ceremony. None of this erases the difficulty of the season, and honest accounts from winter-over veterans rarely pretend otherwise. The middle months, often July and August at the more remote inland stations, tend to be described as the hardest stretch, sometimes referred to informally within the community as the toughest part of the winter. The novelty of the darkness has worn off. Spring still feels impossibly far away, and the accumulated weight of months without fresh air, sunlight, or new faces begins to press on even well-adjusted crew members. Station doctors and, at larger stations, psychologists trained in isolation environments watch carefully for signs of what is sometimes called winter-over syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that can include irritability, difficulty concentrating, sleep disruption, and low mood, believed to be linked both to the loss of natural light and to the compounding effects of prolonged isolation. Addressing this is not treated as optional or as something people are simply expected to push through alone. Regular, informal check-ins, group activities, exercise, and simply the presence of colleagues trained to notice when someone has gone quiet in a way that seems different from their usual quiet, all form part of the unofficial support system that keeps a station functioning through its hardest weeks. Communication with the outside world, though limited, still exists. Satellite windows allow for scheduled internet access and calls home, often at specific times of day when the satellite a station relies on happens to be positioned correctly overhead. These windows are treated with real importance. A short video call with a family member thousands of kilometers away can matter enormously to someone who has not seen an unfamiliar face in 5 months. It would be easy to describe all of this and still miss the central point, which is that people who complete an Antarctic winter overwhelmingly describe it afterward as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives, hardship included. There is something about surviving genuine isolation, together, with a small group of people who become, by necessity, closer than most ordinary friendships ever require. That seems to leave a lasting mark. The darkness does not simply get endured, it gets shared, and shared difficulty, it turns out, tends to bind people more tightly than shared comfort ever could. Outside, meanwhile, the world these small communities have built their entire structure to withstand continues doing exactly what Antarctic winter does best, which is remind everyone, regularly and without much warning, exactly how much power it still holds over anyone who steps beyond the station's walls. What that power looks like, and how a station responds when the weather turns from merely cold to genuinely dangerous, is where we're headed next. Blizzards in Antarctica are not simply heavy snowfall, and it is worth clearing up that misunderstanding early, because the reality is considerably more dramatic and considerably more dangerous than the word blizzard tends to suggest anywhere else in the world. Much of the interior of Antarctica actually receives very little new snowfall each year, technically qualifying large sections of the continent as a kind of desert. The blinding whiteout conditions that trap stations for days are usually not caused by snow falling from the sky at all. They are caused by wind, ferocious and sustained, picking up the snow already lying on the ground and hurling it sideways with enough force to reduce visibility to almost nothing within seconds. These events are known as ground blizzards, and Antarctica produces some of the most severe examples found anywhere on the planet. Katabatic winds, formed as dense, cold air flows downhill from the high interior plateau toward the coast under the pull of gravity, can reach speeds well over 100 kilometers per hour during the worst storms. When that wind meets loose surface snow, the result is a wall of white that can swallow a building entirely from the perspective of anyone standing even a short distance away. Visibility can drop to less than the length of an outstretched arm. Anyone caught outside without an immediate way back indoors is in genuine danger, not from cold alone, though the wind chill during these storms is severe, but from simply losing all sense of direction in a landscape that offers no landmarks to begin with. Stations prepare for this reality as a matter of routine rather than emergency. Many facilities install fixed rope lines strung between buildings, specifically so that anyone required to move between structures during a storm has something physical to hold and follow, a lifeline in the most literal sense, allowing a person to keep moving in the correct direction even when they cannot see their own boots. Weather monitoring is constant, and station leadership does not hesitate to declare what is often called a storm condition, restricting or entirely halting outdoor movement until conditions ease. During the most severe of these declared conditions, sometimes referred to using a tiered system depending on the station, all outdoor travel stops completely, and the entire crew simply waits the storm out indoors, sometimes for a day, sometimes considerably longer. For anyone trying to sleep during one of these events, the experience is unlike almost anything available elsewhere on Earth. The wind does not simply blow. It presses against reinforced walls with a steady physical force, audible even through thick insulation, a low roar that can continue for the better part of a day without pause. Some winter-over veterans describe eventually finding the sound almost comforting, a wild, indifferent noise on the other side of a wall that is, itself, entirely unbothered by it. Others describe the opposite, an unsettling awareness of exactly how much violence is happening only a few meters away, held back by nothing more than careful engineering and a well-maintained heating system. Either way, sleep continues, because it has to, and because the routines built into station life do not pause, simply because the weather outside has turned dangerous. Meals are still served. Lights still dim in the evening according to the same schedule maintained every other night of the season. If anything, severe storms tend to reinforce just how important that consistent internal rhythm has become, since it is often the only stable, unchanging thing left when the world outside has become entirely unpredictable. Storms of this kind also serve as a stark, physical reminder of exactly what separates the people inside a station from the environment surrounding it. It is not much, in the end. A layer of insulated wall, a reliable heating system, careful engineering refined over decades of prior winters. Remove any one of those elements, and the difference between survival and serious danger narrows considerably. This is part of why station maintenance during winter is treated with such seriousness, and why support staff, the engineers, mechanics, and technicians who keep generators running and systems functioning are considered every bit as essential to the mission as the scientists whose research often draws the public's attention. A perfectly designed experiment means very little if the building housing it loses heat during a storm that will not ease for 2 more days. Not every storm arrives as a full, station-halting event. Many winters bring a steady rhythm of smaller disturbances, wind picking up for a few hours, visibility dropping, then clearing again by the following morning. Crews learn to read these patterns the way people anywhere learn to read the particular weather of the place they live, developing an intuitive sense for which gray mornings will pass quickly and which carry the particular stillness that tends to precede something worse. That knowledge accumulates slowly, season after season, carried forward by returning veterans and passed along, deliberately and informally, to newcomers experiencing their first Antarctic winter. What eventually breaks the pattern, of course, is not simply the passing of another storm, but the slow, almost imperceptible return of something the continent has not offered in months. Somewhere in the depths of this darkness, alongside the wind and the routine, and the small, hard-won comforts of station life, something else occasionally appears overhead, unrelated to any storm at all, and offering, for a few strange and beautiful hours, one of the only visual rewards this entire season has to give. That, and the small rituals crews build around the darkest, quietest hours of their evenings, is where we're headed next. Not everything about an Antarctic winter is difficult, and it would be a disservice to the people who choose this life to suggest otherwise. Amid the cold, the isolation, and the long stretches of darkness, the same conditions that make winter so demanding also produce something genuinely rare, a sky unlike almost anywhere else inhabited on Earth, and within it, on the right night, the aurora australis, the southern counterpart to the more widely known northern lights. The physics behind the aurora is the same at both poles. Charged particles from the sun, carried outward on the solar wind, collide with gases in Earth's upper atmosphere, and those collisions release light, curtains and ribbons of green, sometimes shifting into red, purple, or a pale, ghostly blue, moving slowly across the sky as though the atmosphere itself were breathing. What makes the Antarctic version particularly striking is the setting it appears in. There is no light pollution to compete with, none of the ambient glow that dims the aurora in almost every other place on the planet where it can occasionally be seen. Against the total darkness of a polar winter sky, over a landscape of undisturbed snow, stretching to every horizon, the aurora can appear with a clarity that visitors and longtime station staff alike often describe as difficult to fully put into words. Station crews develop their own quiet customs around this. Some stations maintain an informal alert system, someone checking conditions late at night and sending word through the building if the aurora is putting on a particularly strong display, prompting a small, half-dressed procession of people pulling on enough layers to step outside briefly and look up before the cold drives them back indoors. It becomes, for many, one of the defining memories of an entire winter, standing in temperatures that would be dangerous to endure for long, wrapped in every available layer, watching green light move slowly across a sky containing more stars than most people will ever see anywhere else in their lives. These moments aside, most evenings settle into something far quieter and more ordinary, and that ordinariness is, in its own way, exactly the point. As the station's artificial evening arrives, marked by dimmed lighting in common areas rather than any change outside, the day's structured pace begins to soften. Work concludes at its usual hour. Dinner is served, eaten together in the dining hall the way it has been every night for months, conversation settling into whatever rhythm this particular group of people has developed by now, familiar enough that long silences no longer feel awkward, only comfortable. After dinner, the station's small collection of communal spaces fills gradually. Someone starts a movie in the lounge. A card game gathers a handful of players around a table that has hosted the same game, more or less, several nights a week since March. Some crew members retreat instead to the gym for a late workout, using physical exhaustion deliberately as a tool to make sleep easier to find later. Others head for the small library, selecting from a shelf built up by years of previous winter-over crews, each book a quiet trace of someone who sat in this same building, through this same darkness, in some earlier season. Eventually, one by one, people begin drifting back toward their private rooms. This transition tends to happen gradually, rather than all at once. No single moment marking the official end of the evening, simply a slow thinning of the common areas as tiredness catches up with each person according to their own particular rhythm. Inside their rooms, the routines narrow further into something almost identical to bedtime rituals anywhere else in the world. A book read for a few final pages. A journal kept by many winter-over crew members specifically to process an experience they know. Even while living it, they will want to remember clearly later. Blackout coverings drawn fully across windows, sealing out both the ordinary darkness of the season and the occasional, unpredictable glow of the aurora, ensuring that whatever light exists outside does not interrupt the deep, uninterrupted rest the body has been carefully trained, meal by meal and lights out by lights out, to expect at this particular hour. And then, finally, sleep. Ordinary, unremarkable sleep, arriving the same way it does for nearly everyone, everywhere, at the end of an ordinary day. The difference, of course, is everything surrounding that sleep. The 80-degree gap between the warmth of the room and the cold pressing against its walls. The absence of any sunrise waiting on the other side of the night. The small, deliberate rituals built by hand to replace what the sky can no longer provide. Somewhere out there tonight, in a research station raised above the ice, someone is closing their eyes in exactly this way, trusting a routine built carefully enough over enough winters by enough careful people to carry them safely through to the next artificial morning and eventually, months from now, to a real one. Somewhere behind the ordinary rhythm of meals and lights out and dimmed common rooms sits a quieter, more serious layer of preparation, one that most winter-over crew members hope never to need, and that station planners nonetheless treat as absolutely essential. Medicine in Antarctica during winter operates under a set of constraints, unlike almost anywhere else a person might fall ill or be injured. There is no ambulance. There is no hospital within reach. Once the last flight departs in the final weeks of autumn, whoever is on the ice is, for all practical purposes, on their own until spring, regardless of what happens in between. Most stations address this by stationing a single physician, sometimes supported by additional medically trained staff, who serves as doctor, dentist, and occasionally surgeon for the entire winter overpopulation. These are not ordinary medical postings. Candidates are selected specifically for their ability to function independently, often required to demonstrate competence across a far wider range of procedures than a typical general practitioner would ever be asked to perform, because there is no specialist to refer a difficult case to, no second opinion available except by satellite phone, and no possibility of transferring a patient elsewhere until the weather and the calendar both cooperate. Some station doctors have historically had to perform procedures well outside their usual specialty, guided at times by remote consultation with distant colleagues, because the alternative, waiting for outside help, simply was not an option. This isolation shapes daily life in quieter ways too. Before the last flight departs each year, station doctors conduct thorough medical and dental screenings on every incoming winter-over crew member, looking for any condition that might reasonably worsen or require treatment during the coming months. A wisdom tooth that might need extraction someday is often addressed before departure rather than risked later. Chronic conditions are reviewed carefully, medications stocked in quantities well beyond what a normal prescription would cover, because reordering is not possible once the season closes. This careful screening is not bureaucratic caution for its own sake. It reflects a hard truth about the environment these crews are entering, one where even a manageable problem elsewhere in the world can become a serious one when help is genuinely, completely unreachable for months. Stations maintain surprisingly well-equipped medical facilities given their remote circumstances, including basic surgical capability, imaging equipment, and a stocked pharmacy calculated to last the full winter with margin for the unexpected. Every consumable, every bandage and vial and instrument is counted and logged against a projected need that has to account not just for ordinary wear, but for whatever unlucky combination of events might arise in a group of several dozen people over 8 months. Supplies are organized with redundancy in mind, because a single damaged or contaminated batch of something essential cannot simply be replaced with a phone call, the way it might be anywhere else. Telemedicine plays an increasingly important role too, with modern stations able to consult remotely with specialists elsewhere in the world during scheduled communication windows, offering guidance even when physical transport remains impossible. a doctor on the ice describing symptoms and test results to a colleague thousands of kilometers away, both of them working from the same understanding that whatever decision they reach will need to be carried out with only the tools and hands already present in the room. In the most extreme emergencies, historically, some stations have arranged daring midwinter evacuation flights, landing on ice runways in complete darkness under conditions pilots elsewhere would never accept, guided by nothing more than flares set out along the runway and the steady nerve of crews trained for exactly this kind of operation. These flights remain rare, dangerous, and treated as an absolute last resort rather than a routine safety net, reserved for situations where the alternative is considered worse than the very real risk the flight itself carries. The mere existence of that option, however seldom used, offers a kind of psychological reassurance to winter-over crews, even as everyone involved understands just how unlikely and how last resort it truly is. Knowing this reality shapes the psychology of station life in ways that are easy to overlook from a distance. Winter-over crew members tend to describe a heightened background awareness of their own physical caution, a tendency to move a little more carefully on icy walkways, to double-check equipment before using it, to think twice before taking a risk that might seem trivial anywhere else. It is not fear most describe, so much as a quiet, practical respect for the fact that the safety net most people take for granted simply does not exist out here in the way it does at home. Small injuries that would warrant nothing more than a shrug elsewhere, a sprained ankle, a minor cut, a persistent headache, are watched a little more closely, treated a little more seriously, precisely because the margin for things going wrong is thinner than almost anyone is used to living with. That respect, cultivated deliberately by station training and reinforced quietly by the doctors themselves, becomes one more invisible thread holding the entire community safely through its most isolated months, a form of care that runs beneath the surface of daily life without ever needing to be spoken aloud. Mental health support runs alongside physical medicine as an equally serious concern, and most stations now treat psychological well-being with the same deliberate planning once reserved only for broken bones and burst appendixes. Larger stations often include a trained counselor or psychologist among the winter-over staff, someone whose entire role is simply to be available, to notice when a usually talkative crew member has gone quiet, to offer a private space for whatever weight someone might be carrying that they do not want to burden their small community with directly. Even where no dedicated specialist is present, station doctors typically receive additional training in recognizing the early signs of isolation-related distress, since the same environment that makes physical injury more dangerous also makes psychological strain harder to escape from. There is no long walk to clear one's head that leads anywhere but back to the same building, no drive to a different neighborhood, no visit to an old friend across town. Whatever difficulty a person is carrying travels with them through every hallway of the station, every meal, every shared evening in the lounge, and the isolation that makes this so challenging is precisely why so much care goes into building the routines, the community rituals, and the quiet oversight described throughout this story. All of this medical caution exists in service of something larger, the actual reason most of these people came to Antarctica in the first place, which is the science itself, and it turns out that the very conditions making winter so demanding, the darkness, the cold, the isolation, are precisely what make this season uniquely valuable for certain kinds of research that simply cannot be conducted anywhere else on Earth at any other time of year. The polar night that makes sleep so complicated for the human body turns out to be an extraordinary gift for astronomy. At inland stations like the South Pole, 6 uninterrupted months without a sunrise means 6 uninterrupted months during which certain telescopes can observe the same patch of sky continuously. Without the daily interruption every other observatory on the planet must work around. Combined with the extreme dryness of the high polar plateau, air so cold it holds almost no moisture, and the remarkable atmospheric stability found at these latitudes, the South Pole has become one of the finest locations on Earth for certain kinds of astronomical and cosmological research, rivaling conditions found at only a handful of other sites worldwide, including some of the driest deserts and highest mountain observatories anywhere. This combination of dryness, darkness, and stillness is rare enough that scientists sometimes describe the South Pole less as a research station with a telescope attached, and more as a natural instrument in its own right, one that happens to also require heated buildings and hot meals to keep its operators alive. Telescopes stationed here study some of the oldest light in the universe, cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the earliest moments after the Big Bang, work that requires exactly the kind of dry, dark, stable, uninterrupted viewing conditions that only a polar winter can reliably provide. Even small amounts of atmospheric water vapor can interfere with these observations elsewhere in the world, which is part of why researchers travel to one of the most physically punishing environments on the planet, simply to get a clearer look at something that happened billions of years ago. Neutrino observatories, built directly into the deep ice itself using enormous arrays of sensors lowered into holes drilled more than a kilometer down, take advantage of the sheer purity and depth of Antarctic ice to detect subatomic particles arriving from distant reaches of space, a kind of research that depends entirely on this specific, remote, frozen location existing exactly as it does, unreplicated anywhere else on the planet. Atmospheric scientists, meanwhile, use the winter months to study the upper atmosphere and the seasonal chemistry that leads to the formation of the ozone hole each spring, tracking measurements that require a continuous winter baseline for comparison. Data that has to be gathered consistently through months most researchers elsewhere would never willingly work in. Glaciologists monitor ice cores and ice movement, work that continues through winter specifically because certain measurements benefit from conditions with minimal seasonal disturbance, capturing a kind of steady, undisturbed data that summer's bustle of aircraft and vehicles would only complicate. Even the extreme isolation itself becomes a subject of study, with some winter-over crews participating in research on human physiology and psychology under prolonged isolation, work that has direct relevance to future long-duration space missions. Since a winter at an Antarctic station shares more in common with the isolation of a distant space voyage than almost any other environment available to researchers on Earth, right down to the small crew, the sealed environment, and the complete absence of any possibility of leaving early. None of this research happens by accident or without enormous advance preparation. Every experiment running through winter was planned, tested, and provisioned for during the short summer season, because once the last flight departs, there is no possibility of shipping in a replacement part, a missing reagent, or a piece of equipment someone forgot to pack. Scientists spend the brief summer months not only running their own experiments, but preparing everything their winter colleagues will need for the months of research ahead, an entire year's planning compressed into a narrow window before the ice closes the door behind them, every checklist reviewed twice, every backup accounted for, because a missing part discovered in July might as well not exist at all. The scientists themselves who choose to winter over are, in a sense, a self-selected group, drawn to a kind of work that offers unusually direct rewards for unusually difficult conditions. Many describe a particular satisfaction in knowing that their measurements, gathered through months, most people would never willingly endure, form part of datasets used by researchers around the world who will never set foot on the ice themselves. A physicist monitoring a neutrino detector through the depths of a polar night is, in effect, keeping a kind of watch, tending an instrument that cannot simply be left running unsupervised, checking readings, troubleshooting the inevitable small failures that extreme cold produces in even the most carefully engineered equipment, and doing so with the quiet understanding that this data, gathered nowhere else on Earth, might eventually answer questions the rest of physics has been asking for decades. This same narrow window governs almost everything else about how a station survives its coming winter. And understanding it means stepping back briefly from the science and the medicine to look at something more basic. How exactly does enough food, fuel, and equipment to sustain several dozen people for 8 isolated months actually arrive in the first place? And what happens in the final frantic weeks before that access disappears completely until spring? Preparing an Antarctic station for winter is, in essence, an enormous logistical operation compressed into a very short season, and it begins months before the darkness actually arrives. Supply ships and aircraft use the brief Antarctic summer, when sea ice recedes enough for vessels to approach the coast, and temperatures allow safer flight operations, to deliver nearly everything a station will need for the entire year ahead. Fuel arrives in enormous quantities, calculated carefully against projected consumption with a safety margin built in, because running short partway through winter is simply not a problem that can be solved once the supply ships have gone. Food arrives by the ton, an extraordinary variety of frozen, canned, dried, and shelf-stable goods, along with fresh produce that will be eaten quickly in the final weeks before the season closes, since nothing fresh survives the winter that follows unless it is grown indoors under carefully managed light. Spare parts for nearly every system the station depends on are stocked in advance, sometimes redundantly, because a generator failure in the deep cold of July cannot wait for a replacement part to be flown in from anywhere. Medical supplies, described earlier, are stocked with the same forward-looking caution. Even seemingly minor items, extra light bulbs for months of artificial daylight, replacement filters, specific tools for repairs that inevitably arise, are inventoried and packed with a seriousness that reflects a simple, unavoidable fact. Whatever is not on the station by the time the last flight leaves will not be available until the first flight of the following spring, months later, and by then, whatever problem it was meant to solve may already have become considerably larger. Station logistics staff spend the summer months essentially running an entire small town's worth of procurement, cross-checking inventories against past winters, adjusting quantities based on the specific size and needs of the incoming crew, and building in enough margin to absorb whatever unexpected demand the coming months might bring. This preparation extends to the people as well. Incoming winter-over crew members typically arrive well before the season actually closes, allowing time for training, familiarization with station systems, and the gradual handover of responsibilities from outgoing summer staff. Fire safety training receives particular emphasis, since fire represents one of the gravest risks a station can face. In an environment this cold and this remote, a serious fire could be catastrophic in ways almost impossible to recover from, and most stations run frequent, rigorous fire drills specifically because the isolation removes any possibility of outside firefighting support arriving in time to help, leaving the crew itself as the only fire department it will ever have for the next 8 months. Every person on station, regardless of their actual job title, is typically trained in some basic firefighting and emergency response role, because in a community this small, everyone is, by necessity, part of the emergency response team. As the final weeks of the short summer season wind down, there is often a distinct shift in mood around a station, a kind of quickening. The last flights are scheduled and reconfirmed against weather forecasts that grow more urgent with each passing day, since a delayed final flight risks being stranded on the wrong side of the closing season entirely. Outgoing summer staff say their goodbyes, sometimes with real emotion, aware that the small winter-over group they are leaving behind will spend the coming months in a kind of isolation the departing staff themselves will not experience. And then, finally, the last aircraft lifts off the ice, engines fading into the distance, and the remaining crew watches the sky empty out above them, aware that whatever happens next, for the next several months, they will be facing it entirely on their own. It is a strange, quiet moment by most accounts, equal parts anticipation and a kind of settling resolve, the true beginning of the season everything else has been building toward. The scale of this operation is easy to underestimate from the outside. A single winter-over station might require hundreds of tons of fuel, carefully calculated against generator load, heating demand, and vehicle use, with enough buffer built in to survive an unusually harsh season without ever approaching a genuine shortage. Food orders are planned not simply by total calories, but by variety, since station managers have learned over decades that morale suffers considerably when a crew is left eating the same handful of meals on repeat for months. Careful menu planning, rotating through dozens of different dinners across the season, having become almost as important to winter survival as the fuel itself, a recognition that keeping people well fed in body is inseparable from keeping them steady in mind through a season this long and this dark. Once that last flight disappears over the horizon, a station's connection to the rest of the world does not vanish entirely, but it narrows considerably, filtered down to whatever bandwidth a handful of orbiting satellites happen to provide. Understanding how that connection actually works helps explain both the comfort it offers and the very real limits that remain, even with modern technology, on how close anyone stuck on the ice can feel to the people they left behind. Satellite coverage over Antarctica is not constant the way it is in most inhabited parts of the world. Because of the continent's extreme southern location and the orbits of the communication satellites most stations depend on, usable internet and phone access is often only available during specific windows each day, sometimes just a few hours, when a particular satellite happens to be positioned correctly overhead. Station life adapts around this reality, the same way it adapts around the artificial daylight schedule, with communication windows becoming their own small anticipated ritual. A specific hour when the internet becomes usable enough for video calls, when emails download in a rush after hours of silence, when someone finally gets to see a photo of a newborn niece or hear a parent's voice for the first time in weeks. Crew members often plan their entire evenings around these windows, finishing dinner a little early or postponing a workout so as not to miss the small stretch of connectivity the satellite happens to provide that day. Older generations of Antarctic researchers had it considerably harder. Decades ago, communication with the outside world during winter might have meant nothing more than occasional crackling radio contact, letters that would not be answered for months, and a sense of distance from home that modern crews, even with their limited bandwidth, rarely have to fully confront. The gradual improvement of satellite technology has narrowed that gap significantly, and today's winter-over crews, while still far more isolated than almost anyone else on the planet, at least have the ability to see a familiar face on a screen during their scheduled window, a small but meaningful thread connecting the coldest, darkest place most of them will ever live to the ordinary, sunlit world, continuing on without them. Some describe this modern connectivity as a double-edged comfort. Welcome for the closeness it provides, but also a reminder, every time the window closes and the connection drops, of exactly how far away that ordinary world still is. Internally, stations rely on their own local networks for the countless small tasks of daily operation. Monitoring equipment, managing supplies, coordinating schedules, and keeping records of the ongoing science that continues regardless of what the satellites overhead are doing at any given moment. This internal infrastructure, maintained by the same small technical staff responsible for keeping the generators running and the heat flowing, forms its own quiet backbone beneath everything else happening at the station, invisible until something goes wrong, and carefully, continuously protected against exactly that possibility. A station's IT technician, in this sense, becomes just as essential to winter survival as its doctor or its cook, quietly responsible for making sure the thin thread connecting this small, isolated world to the rest of humanity never goes dark for longer than it has to. As the winter wears on and the satellite windows continue their quiet daily rhythm, something else begins happening on a much longer timescale, one that no communication technology controls and no engineering can hurry along. Somewhere past the depths of midwinter, past the hardest stretch that so many veterans describe as the true test of the season, the smallest, faintest suggestion of change begins to appear at the edge of each day, and the entire station, in its own quiet way, begins waiting for it. The return of light to an Antarctic station does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in, almost imperceptibly at first, weeks before anyone would call it daylight in any ordinary sense. At the South Pole, after 6 full months without a sunrise, the first hint of returning light appears not as sunshine, but as the faintest suggestion of a glow along the horizon. A change so subtle that early observers might question whether they imagined it. Crew members who have lived through a previous winter tend to notice it first, trained by experience to recognize the difference between the deep, absolute black of midwinter and the first, barely perceptible softening that signals spring is, at last, approaching. A shift measured not in brightness, but in the faintest suggestion of color, where before there was none at all. This period carries its own particular psychological weight, distinct from both the settling calm of early winter and the difficult, weary middle stretch so many describe as the hardest. There is a rising anticipation now, a sense of counting down, even as the actual temperatures often remain just as brutally cold, sometimes colder, than anything experienced earlier in the season. The atmosphere can behave strangely during this transition, and some of the coldest recorded temperatures at inland stations occur not at the darkest point of midwinter, but in the weeks leading up to the sun's actual return, a reminder that light and warmth, so closely linked in most people's intuition, do not always move in perfect step with each other on this particular continent. Station routines adjust subtly during this stretch as well. Conversations shift, almost without anyone deciding it should, toward the coming return of outside contact, the eventual arrival of the first flights, the reintroduction of fresh food, and, for many, the bittersweet approach of the end of an experience that has defined nearly a year of their lives. Photographs from this period, taken by crew members documenting their own winter, often capture the same subject again and again, a faint band of color low on the horizon, slightly brighter each day, marking a transition too gradual to see happening in real time, but unmistakable when compared across a week or two of patient, quiet observation. And then eventually, at a specific and carefully anticipated moment, the sun itself returns. At the South Pole, this typically happens in late September, the culmination of 6 months without it. And stations often mark the occasion with real ceremony, gathering outside in the bitter cold, specifically to watch the moment arrive, a ritual not unlike the midwinter dinner months earlier, another deliberate marker placed on a calendar that would otherwise offer very few natural ones. For many winter-over veterans, this sunrise, the first they will have seen in half a year, remains one of the most vivid memories of their entire lives, disproportionate in emotional weight to what is, after all, simply the sun doing what it does every single day, almost everywhere else on the planet. What that return actually means for the station, for the science, for the sleep schedules so carefully built around 6 months of unbroken dark, and for the small, tightly bound community about to expand again as summer staff and fresh supplies finally make their way back across the ice, is where the final stretch of this story is headed next. The return of the sun does not immediately undo 6 months of accumulated darkness, and this is one of the more surprising parts of the transition for anyone imagining that a single sunrise might simply reset everything back to normal. The body's internal clock, having spent half a year adjusting to an artificial schedule built entirely out of habit, meal times, and carefully managed lighting, does not snap instantly back into alignment with the returning sun. Sleep researchers who study these transitions describe a period of readjustment that can take days or even weeks as the crew's circadian rhythms slowly recalibrate to a light source that is, at first, still low, pale, and available for only a few hours each day, gradually lengthening as the season moves toward the long light of summer. There is, in fact, a kind of mirror image challenge waiting on the other side of winter. Just as the body struggled to find its footing without any natural light cue at all, it now has to adjust to a rapidly changing one. Daylight hours expanding noticeably week by week, eventually stretching toward the near-continuous daylight of the Antarctic summer, when the sun barely dips below the horizon at all. Station routines, so carefully built to compensate for total darkness, now shift to compensate for the opposite extreme, with blackout curtains once again becoming essential. This time, to block out a sun that refuses to set, rather than to preserve a darkness the sky was not offering on its own. Energy levels shift noticeably during this transition as well, and many winter-over veterans describe an unexpected surge of restlessness as the light returns, a kind of pent-up momentum after months of careful, contained routine. Physical activity often increases. Outdoor tasks that were postponed or minimized during the most dangerous winter months resume in earnest, weather permitting, and the station itself begins the long process of preparing for its own seasonal transformation from a small, sealed winter community back into the busier, more populated research base it becomes each summer. This is also, for many crew members, a period of quiet reflection on the months just completed. Journals kept throughout the darkness are reread. Conversations turn toward comparing notes on how each person experienced the same winter differently, what helped them most, which weeks felt hardest, which small rituals turned out to matter more than anyone expected going in. There is a particular kind of camaraderie in this stretch, a shared sense of having come through something together, even as everyone privately knows that within weeks, this same small, tightly knit group will begin to disperse, some staying on for another season, most preparing to leave for the first time in nearly a year. Meanwhile, far above the station, the same telescopes and detectors that relied on total darkness for their observations must now adjust their own operations to the returning light, some instruments concluding their most sensitive data collection for the year, others shifting toward different kinds of measurements better suited to the changing season. The rhythm of science, like the rhythm of sleep, follows the sun as closely as the rhythm of everything else, at the bottom of the world, a reminder that in this particular environment, almost nothing operates entirely independently of the light or the lack of it, moving slowly overhead. Station maintenance shifts its focus during this period as well. Equipment that endured 6 months of extreme cold and near constant darkness often requires careful inspection now that conditions allow for it. Technicians checking seals, wiring, and moving parts for the kind of slow wear that only becomes fully visible once temperatures begin, very gradually, to rise. Vehicles that sat largely idle through the darkest months are serviced and tested. Roof lines and building exteriors, buried under months of accumulated snow and ice, are inspected and cleared where necessary, the physical structure of the station itself emerging, quite literally, from the long winter alongside the people living inside it. There is a particular kind of collective energy that builds during this stretch, distinct from anything the station has felt since the last flight departed the previous autumn. Conversations in the dining hall shift subtly, less focused on simply making it through another day, and more focused on what comes next. Who is staying for another season? Who is counting down their final weeks? What everyone plans to do first, once they finally step off the ice and back into a world with variable weather, unfamiliar faces, and grocery stores stocked with more than the winter's carefully rationed inventory. As the light continues its steady return, another kind of anticipation begins building alongside it, one connected not to the sky this time, but to the horizon itself, where, for the first time in many months, the machinery of the outside world is preparing to reach the station again. The first flights of the new season do not arrive the moment the sun returns, and the gap between sunrise and actual outside contact can still stretch for several more weeks, since flight operations require not just enough light, but stable enough weather and long enough daylight windows to be conducted safely. Still, once that gap finally closes, the change to station life is immediate, and by most accounts, almost overwhelming after so many months of a fixed, unchanging small community. The sound of an approaching aircraft, something the winter overcrew has not heard in the better part of a year, tends to draw nearly everyone outside regardless of the temperature, gathering to watch the plane's arrival with an intensity that a routine flight would never receive anywhere else in the world. New faces begin appearing, cautiously at first, station veterans and newcomers alike, a little unsure how to reintroduce a stream of unfamiliar people into a community that has spent months defined precisely by how small and unchanging it was. Fresh food arrives on these early flights too, and the reintroduction of simple items, fresh fruit, vegetables, dairy that has not come from a powdered or long life carton, is frequently described by winter over veterans as one of the most viscerally memorable moments of the entire transition, an ordinary grocery store item transformed into something closer to a small miracle after months without it. Mail arrives as well, sometimes months of accumulated letters and packages sent by family members throughout the winter, timed to arrive on this first possible flight. Small physical reminders of a world that continued on without the station's knowledge for the better part of a year. Reading through months of correspondence all at once, catching up on birthdays, holidays, and ordinary family news that happened entirely outside the crew's awareness, is its own strange kind of re-entry, a compressed catch-up on an entire slice of life lived elsewhere, while the station itself remained suspended in its own separate rhythm. Resupply operations ramp up quickly once flights resume. Fuel and construction materials and scientific equipment arriving in a steady rotation now that weather allows it, station logistics staff shifting rapidly from the careful conservation mindset of winter into the busier, more expansive planning required for a full summer season. New research teams begin arriving as well. Scientists whose work depends on the brief window of accessible summer conditions, swelling the station's population back toward its warm season peak within a matter of weeks, a dramatic shift from the tight, unchanging group that has defined the community since the previous autumn. For departing winter over crew members, this period carries a particular emotional complexity. There is genuine relief, understandably, at the prospect of returning to family, to varied food, to the simple freedom of being able to leave a building without checking wind speed and visibility first. But there is often an unexpected grief as well, a recognition that the specific, intense, unrepeatable experience of this particular winter, with this particular small group of people, is ending, and that whatever bond formed through those shared months of darkness will now be tested by distance and ordinary life resuming on every side. Many describe genuine difficulty saying goodbye to colleagues who, only a year earlier, had been complete strangers, and who became, through nothing more than shared isolation and shared routine, something closer to family. Eventually, one by one, the winter over crew departs, boarding flights out over the same ice that closed behind them so completely the previous autumn, headed back toward a world that, for them, has been almost entirely on pause since the darkness began. Eventually, one by one, the winter over crew departs, boarding flights out over the same ice that closed behind them so completely the previous autumn, headed back toward a world that, for them, has been almost entirely on pause since the darkness began. Departures are often staggered across several weeks rather than happening all at once, station managers and department heads typically remaining until their replacements have arrived and been properly briefed, ensuring that no critical role is ever left uncovered even during this busy transitional period. For those still waiting their turn to leave, watching colleagues depart one flight at a time can carry its own strange emotional texture. Equal parts happiness for a friend finally headed home, and a quiet awareness that the small, tightly bound winter community is dissolving piece by piece, faster than it ever formed. Some crew members choose to stay on for a second consecutive winter, and their reasons vary widely. Some simply find they are not yet finished with the work, drawn back by research left incomplete or a role they feel especially suited for. Others describe a harder-to-articulate pull toward the particular quality of life the winter offers, the deep quiet, the close community, the sense of purpose that comes from being one of a very small number of people, keeping an entire station running through conditions most of the world will never personally experience. These returning veterans often play an important stabilizing role for the incoming crew, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of previous winters, the small tricks and routines that make the darkness easier to bear, passed down informally rather than written in any manual. What waits for them on the other side of that journey, and what the experience of an Antarctic winter tends to leave behind in the people who complete it, is where this story turns next, toward its close. Returning from an Antarctic winter is, by nearly every account, its own strange kind of adjustment, one that mirrors in miniature the same disorientation the body experienced arriving into 6 months of darkness the previous year, only now running in reverse. The sheer sensory overload of the outside world often catches returning crew members off guard. Traffic noise, crowds, the overwhelming variety of a full grocery store, aisles of fresh produce and packaged goods in every direction, after months of a fixed, carefully rationed menu. Some describe feeling genuinely unsettled by simple things most people never think twice about. The sound of a car horn, the press of an unfamiliar crowd, textures and colors and choices that had simply not existed in their daily environment for the better part of a year. Sleep, too, often takes time to fully normalize. Having spent months relying on an artificial schedule built entirely around clocks and habit rather than sunlight, some returning crew members describe an odd period of adjustment even after arriving somewhere with an entirely ordinary day and night cycle, as though the body needs a little extra time to trust that the sun will, once again, simply do what it is supposed to do without any artificial reinforcement required. What tends to remain longest, according to the people who have lived through it, is not the physical adjustment, but something harder to name, a shift in perspective that many describe as permanent. Having survived genuine isolation, genuine cold, and a genuine test of both body and mind, many winter-over veterans report a lasting sense of confidence, a quiet certainty that they can handle far more difficulty than they might have believed possible before going. Ordinary stresses back home, the kind that once felt overwhelming, often feel smaller by comparison, measured now against a winter spent watching the wind press against reinforced walls in complete darkness, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest other human being. There is also, frequently, a lasting appreciation for the small, ordinary comforts that had simply been assumed before, and were suddenly, vividly present again after their absence. Sunlight through a window in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The simple, unremarkable ability to step outside without checking wind speed first. A phone call that connects immediately, without waiting for a satellite to move into position overhead. Many describe carrying this appreciation forward for years, a quiet, permanent shift in how they notice and value things that most people, who have never had them taken away for months at a time, rarely think to notice at all. Professionally, too, the experience tends to leave a mark. Scientists who have completed a winter-over season often speak of the data they gathered, and the discipline required to gather it reliably through such demanding conditions as some of the most meaningful work of their careers, regardless of what else they go on to accomplish afterward. Support staff, the engineers, cooks, doctors, and technicians whose quiet daily work kept the entire station running often describe a similarly deep sense of pride, knowing that the science conducted at the pole depended entirely on their less visible, less celebrated labor holding steady through months when almost nothing about the environment cooperated with the idea of things running smoothly. Researchers who study human performance in extreme environments have taken a growing interest in exactly this kind of experience, and Antarctic winter-over stations are increasingly viewed as one of the closest real-world analogs available for future long-duration space missions. Journeys to the Moon or Mars that would require small crews to live in similarly sealed, isolated conditions for extended periods, far from any possibility of quick rescue or resupply. The lessons learned from decades of Antarctic winters about sleep, about routine, about the psychology of small isolated groups, about the careful engineering required to keep people not just alive, but genuinely well through months of extreme conditions, are quietly informing how future space agencies plan to keep astronauts healthy on journeys that may last far longer than any Antarctic winter ever has. It is worth pausing near the end of this story to notice what all of it actually adds up to. Antarctica's winter did not become survivable because humans found a way to defeat the cold, or outsmart the darkness, or somehow make 6 months without a sunrise feel ordinary. It became survivable because a small group of people, generation after generation, built something deliberate and careful in response to it. Engineering, routine, community, medicine, all of it aimed at the same modest, remarkable goal: letting an ordinary human body do the one thing it has always needed to do at the end of every day, everywhere, which is simply rest. There is something worth carrying away from all of this, wherever you happen to be listening tonight, far from any ice shelf, far from any 6-month night. The people who winter over in Antarctica are not, in the end, defying human limits so much as demonstrating exactly how far careful, deliberate routine can stretch them. A private room, a warm bed, a fixed meal time, a dimmed light in the evening, signaling that the day, however artificial its boundaries, has come to its close. These are small things, easy to take entirely for granted almost everywhere else on Earth, and yet they are precisely what a group of scientists and support staff, thousands of kilometers from anywhere else, have learned to build by hand, season after season, in one of the most hostile environments our species has ever chosen to live in. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson worth taking to bed with you tonight. Rest does not require perfect conditions. It requires consistency, care, and just enough deliberate structure to hold steady when everything else around it will not. Somewhere at the bottom of the world tonight, whether in darkness or in the returning light of an Antarctic spring, someone is closing their bedroom door, drawing a curtain, and trusting a routine built carefully enough to carry them safely through to morning. You can do the same, wherever you are. The wind outside your window, whatever it happens to be doing tonight, is nothing Antarctica hasn't already taught someone how to sleep through. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with Coldman Survival. Sleep well, wherever you are listening from.